Greetings, everybody. This is Tanya Spilovoy, and we are set to have a fantastic chat today about open educational policy and how it affects access and inclusion for higher education. Today, I have three of my very favorite open education leaders in the space, and it's just a thrill and an honor to have you here, part of the WCET annual meeting virtual. So to give you some perspective, open education is a field, and we've had amazing increase in participation over the years. We've seen exponential advancement in research and in participation throughout the world. People and organizations that are represented here have been especially instrumental in driving the increase in adoption of open educational resources, making things open in private and public partnerships, and really engaging a lot of stakeholders in the whole idea of open. So first, I'd like to have the participants and the panelists introduce themselves today. And when they introduce themselves, I'll have them talk about their organization and also what open education or open means to you. So we'll start with Cable Green.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm from Creative Commons. I'm the director of open education there. Let me share just a couple links with you real quick. Here's the link to Creative Commons homepage. And if you'd like to know more about me, there's my bio there as well. I won't bore you with those details. If anybody wants to talk after, feel free to reach out. Happy to chat more. You can also find me on social media. Whoops, that's not right. I'm at C Green. That's the correct one. So what is Creative Commons? If you're unfamiliar with it, Creative Commons is a nonprofit global organization that works to unlock knowledge and culture everywhere in pursuit of a more equitable world. Specifically, you may be familiar with the fact that we build and steward the open licenses that the world uses to openly license their copyrighted works. So when it comes to the discussion around open education, open educational resources are either in the public domain, or more often than not, they have a Creative Commons license on them. So those legal permissions which move something from just being free to being open, those are the Creative Commons licenses which do that. What does open mean to me? I think at a very high level, open means that I think about open access to knowledge and culture being a human right. And as I look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or more recently, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and there's one in particular, which I'll share a link to here in the chat. And that is the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, talks about how it's a human right that everybody has access to quality education opportunities, the resources that go with that. And to me, that's what open's really about. When we're dealing with closed knowledge, when we're dealing with closed cultural works, fundamentally, we're talking about excluding people, not providing opportunities, not reaching the education goals in any particular country. We're by definition cutting out great minds from helping to solve the world's most pressing problems. And so when I think about open, I actually think about it as being critical, not only to the individual and people having good lives and being able to lead the lives that they want to lead, but I believe this is also a social imperative. If we're not open and sharing knowledge and culture and other information that we need to solve big problems, then we're worse off than we would otherwise be. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you. So to take a swing in a totally different direction, we'll have Cailyn Nagle introduce herself, and she's from US PIRG.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. I am so happy to be here. My name is Cailyn Nagle. Like Tanya said, I direct the Affordable Textbooks campaign with US PIRG, and I work really closely with the student PIRGs. So the student PIRGs are a student-directed, student-funded, nonpartisan political nonprofit that work to protect the public against powerful special interests, meaning that there are a lot of really common sense things most people can get behind And one of the things that's stopping these common sense policies from going into effect are powerful special interests that stand in their way. In the early 2000s, students in Southern California identified the textbook marketplace as one of these places where special interests versus public interests were standing in the way. And so they started working around issues of consumer protection around textbooks and saw that there was an open textbook movement already starting to form and grow, and saw this as a really visionary way to solve the problems they were facing as students. I've been working with US PIRG and the Student PIRG since 2016, first as a campus organizer, so a community organizer in Southern California, and now more on a national stage, working with our chapters across the country, student leaders that aren't in our chapters, like student governments, and then with institutions themselves, with either administrators or working with librarians or people that want to work on this from a perspective of just on the ground field work, passing these policies and building support for them. And for me, open education and like open in this way is really about breaking down barriers. It's just something, whether that barrier is that barrier between the lecturer and their class by like looping students into that creative process, or the barriers of the classroom itself. So for example, I was able to send my mom, who didn't get to go to college because of economic issues, a open textbook for French, so that way she can continue learning on her own in a remote part of North Georgia and continue to improve herself with things that she's passionate about. But also it breaks that barrier between even like time, right? It's one of the things that students talk to me about so often is things like calculus textbooks. Calculus hasn't really changed that much in 500 years, and yet they're having to pay for these closed license textbooks when in fact, like these things are in the public domain. So whether it's breaking down the barrier between who creates knowledge and contributes to it, who has access to this information, even outside of the university setting, and just like making information accessible through time, openness can just be incredibly expansive. So it's something that I've been really excited to work on.
That was so awesome. And I just want to say welcome to the folks who are joining our session. I know so many of you, and I'm expecting you to ask some great questions. So I see Tiffany and Wanda and Thomas and Gretchen here. So welcome, and we're happy to see you today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Allen to introduce herself. Her organization is Spark, and to talk about what open education or open means to her.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. So I got my start actually as an undergraduate student myself, frustrated with the high cost of textbooks and not understanding why my 21st century education relied on these static, expensive, out-of-date textbooks when we had a wealth of knowledge at our fingertips on the internet. And I actually have spent my entire career working to build up the open education movement, and have most recently been working with the organization Spark, which is an alliance of academic and research libraries, mostly from across North America, but we have affiliates in Africa and Europe and Japan. And our mission is to make open the default in research and education, recognizing that the systems that we use to share knowledge work better in the open when researchers are able to access the most up-to-date information in their field and be able to apply that to find groundbreaking cures. Nothing, you know, it's more relevant than ever in the environment we're living in right now. But also on the teaching side of things, that professors can get access to the most up-to-date information to teach in the classroom and be able to share and update and adapt educational materials to better serve the students that they teach. And in terms of like what open means to me and to Spark, it's really about doing things better and doing things in all of the ways that are possible in today's world that haven't been possible for most of human history. And, you know, the COVID pandemic has really exposed a lot of the ways in which our society just isn't working. the structural inequities and gaps, some of which already existed and some are new or intensified by the pandemic. And it's exposed in so many ways how the rapid open sharing of information is just vital to the future of humanity. If we're talking very concretely about finding a cure to the pandemic that's ravaging every country on earth, basically. But also thinking about things like how do we start taking steps to dismantle structural inequities and systemic racism in our educational systems and other parts of society? And what tools do we have to be able to change things like the examples we're using in textbooks, and empowering faculty to use their academic freedom to expand the perspectives they're able to give to students in the classroom, and students to be able to participate in that process themselves. So I look at open as a way of tearing down some of those barriers and promoting more free exchanges of knowledge and allowing more people to participate in the conversation.
Thank you so much for those robust introductions, and it's clear that our panelists are very passionate about their topics and what they do. And what we're going to do next is talk about how open exemplifies inclusion. And if there's a way that we could talk about this in more concrete terms or great examples of things that you've seen or changes that you've experienced from probably a more closed environment to a more open environment. One of the things that Cailyn mentioned was how her mother now has access to education. And we're talking about that beyond her, beyond a traditional classroom or a traditional educational experience. I'm wondering how you think that open education or open policy really exemplifies inclusion and especially access. And Nicole talked about that a little bit with the pandemic challenges, and you're welcome to talk about pre-pandemic or current events any way you want. So how about if would Cailyn like to start with that, and we'll kind of mix up the order a bit.
Yeah.
I'll jump in, unmute and jump in.
So I think that I'm gonna use a very tangible example. So when it comes to inclusion, just students being able to be included in class, right? So the pandemic has made this much worse for a lot of students when it comes to online learning, just physically. We don't have universal broadband in the United States. One of the students that I work incredibly closely with, her name is Prabdeep Rai. She is a senior at UCLA, and she's in charge of the textbooks campaign there. But she lives her family is up in the Central Valley. People think about California, they often think about it being very dense everywhere. The Central Valley is very rural. There's not a lot of infrastructure. And she lives in a multi-generational household with her siblings, her parents, and one of her grandparents. And she went home for the beginning of the pandemic, but wasn't able to access her textbooks because a bunch of them were through access codes. And she just didn't have reliable enough internet to access that. And because she's in charge of the textbook campaign at UCLA, she knew that if my teachers had given me an open textbook, I could have just downloaded it once I was on campus and then brought that book home with me and then used it offline. But she's just being excluded from her classes because the technology doesn't give her the flexibility to access her materials. And I know that that's a very tangible way when we talk about inclusion, but she's just very much being excluded from classes because of the closed nature of the materials that she's been assigned, which is really unfortunate because she's an incredibly intelligent and talented student, would have a lot to say, but those things are being cut off. So in even just a physical way, open materials just give students more of an ability to just have that flexibility to access them in ways that make sense. Whether it's pulling them up on their phone on the bus and reading them on the way home or to their job, or being able to have them download it on her computer, or if you're a student who maybe has a learning disability, being able to have a print copy and a digital copy so you can take notes and go at your own pace, are or just like very tangible ways that like open materials can bring that to the classroom and include more students?
So I'm going to add a research study in the chat to support some of the things that Cailyn just talked about. And in a large-scale study at the University of Georgia, they found that students who had access to open education resources and open textbooks actually did better in their classes. They had a smaller chance of getting D's, W's, or F's. And so everything she was talking about as an example is also supported through research. And I'll add that to the chat here for everybody to take a look. And do the others want to chime in on why, how does open exemplify inclusion and access? And there might be examples beyond even North America that you might want to mention too.
I can jump in with two quick examples. So the first one is, I just shared the link. We just worked with, and not just Creative Commons, but many organizations worked with the Smithsonian to help them open up. So it was kind of a two-part process that's still going on. The first part was for them to adopt an open access policy. So the Smithsonian now has a policy that where they have works that are in the public domain, or they have the rights to put works into the public domain using Creative Commons public domain dedication, or it's called CC0, that they'll do so. And then the second part of the project is obviously implementing that. So they've, as a first run, have put almost 3 million of their high resolution images and 3D scans onto their website. And they've also put it in CC Search and in Wikimedia Commons and Google and other places. And the reason I share this, it's not, it's more in the glam space than it is education, but there are, of course, art classes and there are art history courses. And so these resources are used in education. I share this specifically because when we launched this project, the secretary of the Smithsonian, who you may know he's the same person who built the African American Smithsonian Museum and managed that process and did a brilliant job. When he was talking about why the open access policy was important at the Smithsonian, he talked about his own experience and how he and his family lived north, I think it was in New Jersey, and that they would every summer drive down to Washington, D.C. and go to the Smithsonian museums, but that a lot of his friends couldn't. And there were neighborhoods where he lived where they just simply didn't have the means to make that trip. And of course, those are people who are fairly close by. What about everybody else who might want to access any particular museums? It's not so important that it's the Smithsonian. It could be any museum around the world. And if people aren't able to go, if students aren't able to access those resources, they're left at a cultural deficit without knowing or being able to see or discuss the narratives around their history. And so that's one important one. The second quick story that I like to share because it happened. My wife and I, we have two boys. They're in the public school district here in Olympia, Washington, where we live. And we're on the parent-teacher association of the schools where our kids go to school. And Washington State is on the route where migrant families come up from Latin America, and they go through California and pick crops, and they come through Oregon especially in the wine season, and then they come into Washington State. They kind of circle around, and we have a lot of, as you know, apples and strawberries and different things here. And so as the families are moving, they bring their whole family, and the children included. And so as the families are settling and the parents are working, the kids are in school. So we've in these parent-teacher conferences, part of it is that we're welcoming new families to the district. And I know enough Spanish that I sit and I listen to the parents talking to their children in Spanish. And as the forms are being handed out about what's your address and where do you live, and you got to turn these forms in so your kid can get into the district, one of the forms they have to sign is, if my child loses one of the textbooks that they're assigned, they have to pay the district $158. And for these families, they simply don't have that money. They don't have that excess capital. And so time after time, year after year, we hear parents say, essentially, you may not take your books from school to home. You should make friends with somebody who's wealthy enough that they can afford to take their books home, because we're afraid you're going to lose it. And so, when we talk about equity and inclusion and access, for a relatively small amount of money for many people, it's an insurmountable hurdle for some. And it's directly negatively affecting these children's education. And they're already having a hard enough time. They're moving, it's not their native language that they're learning in, and now they're being told that they can't take their learning materials home to do their homework. And so that kind of thing makes me angry. And so the good news, it's not all a sad story. The good news is the district talked about this, and there's been really mass adoption of open up resources materials. The Utah State Math Department's put out some really excellent materials. The high schools are increasingly looking at OpenStax textbooks for the 11th and 12th grades in particular, and some of the AP and IB courses. And so that's great. And all those materials are under a Creative Commons attribution license and are freely accessible. The districts are printing copies for the students. And so we're taking some of those problems away through open education.
That was a fantastic story about how access and inclusion is increased through open. Nicole, I'd love to hear you chime in and talk about your viewpoint about how open exemplifies inclusion and access.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, because access and inclusion aren't static things. They're active processes. And as we think about openness and the intersection with access inclusion, it's important to think about the ways in which people are involved. And I think there's so many compelling stories about how people have leveraged the fact that resources are open to make them more inclusive. For example, just to give one example, Professor Jasmine Roberts from Ohio State University has talked about how she teaches strategic communications, and she's updated her open textbook to talk about Judy Smith, who's actually the real life Olivia Pope. So bringing in examples of, women of color who are making phenomenal contributions to the field to make sure that her students are reading about diverse perspectives as they're learning. I think another really compelling example is from the physics department at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So I think many of you may be familiar with OpenStax, based out of Rice University here in the US, has published a number of open textbooks and high enrollment subjects. Actually, right behind me are some of their textbooks. So they published an astronomy textbook, and it's easy to think, once we publish these resources, they're available for the entire world to be able to use. But the reality is that the night sky in Cape Town looks very different than the night sky from Houston or any part of the Northern Hemisphere. They see different constellations. They see the moon. The moon is upside down or the other side up from our perspective. So if you're reading an astronomy textbook from the Northern Hemisphere, students aren't going to be able to go outside and look up at the night sky and see what they're supposed to learn. So the scholars at the University of Cape Town made an adaptation of that open textbook that was relevant to the Southern Hemisphere. And I just think that's a really compelling example of how open enables people to make resources more inclusive and accessible to the people who are using them. And that kind of innovation would not have been possible with a traditional textbook that's closed copyright.
So you're making me think of all kinds of great things, but I'm hearing all kinds of inclusion, including language inclusion, cultural inclusion, geographic inclusion that really breaks down barriers and creates access for people all over the world. There is, this reminds me too of when I was working with Colorado, they have a yearly scan of the education that's happening in the state with education in general. And one of the things that, well, actually all of your ideas really tipped this off for me, but when they scanned their dual credit students who were in these concurrent enrollment courses, with, so it would be like a high school senior taking college classes for credit. They found that the dominant geographic, their dominant participants in that were white, middle class or upper class students, and that it just wasn't accessible to so many students of color and people from low incomes. And they realized that the main barrier for dual credit and concurrent enrollment students was the cost of the textbook. And so when we're talking about really breaking down barriers, we're seeing that that happens even right here in the United States, and we don't think that it's applicable to us, but it really happens. And all of you gave great examples of ways we could make the education more inclusive. I really liked one of the things Nicole kind of touched on, and she was talking about open pedagogy and including students and adapting the books as they are. So hopefully we can talk more about that as we go into this, but we're really here to talk about policy. And so we've kind of done this open scan about why open education matters, why it exemplifies inclusion. And now I'd like to really dig into what policies that you think make a difference. And for those who are here from state level or from system levels, you might be interested in great examples of where policy makes a difference. And I'd like to start with Nicole on this, and we'll just kind of reverse the order and then ask people to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, as with anything in policy, policy is a tool, and it really depends on context. So there are lots of different types of examples of open education policies that have made a difference, and what is right for, your institution or your state or whatever context you're working within really depends on the specifics. And I think one of the exciting things about open education is that there are a lot of different policy levers through which it can make a difference. One of the policies that Spark has advocated for, along with US PIRG in partnership at the federal level, is the Open Textbook Pilot, which funds grants to colleges and universities for open textbook programs. This is actually modeled on a number of different state grant programs that have been highly successful in seeding effective programs that have saved students 10, 20 times the amount of money that was originally invested. Actually, I know the state of North Dakota, where Tanya is and helped drive, is a phenomenal example where their state auditor found that the state turned $110,000 investment into many $1 million of student savings. And where else in public policy do you have that kind of impact where you can invest a small amount of money and achieve an enormous outcome for students? Other types of policies are looking at bringing people together, so convening stakeholders. I think the states of Massachusetts and Colorado are really great examples of this, where the state has actually convened conversations among the state's higher education institutions about what makes sense in that state, and having that conversation about what are our needs first, and then developing policies that help support and fill those needs, whether that's funding, whether that's requiring that institutions mark in their course catalogs which courses are using OER, whether it's supporting convenings and professional development within the state. There's just sort of a whole menu of options out there that can help support and advance open education. And I'm happy to drop into the chat a link to Spark's State Policy Playbook, which offers some options. I think we have some updates to do in terms of what specifically around COVID can be done. But, I think really at the end of the day, advancing open education through policy is about just doing education better and finding ways to sort of remove some of those barriers to access and leverage the free resources that are out there.
That was great to talk about state and state policy and what has been done at the state level. Does anybody have more institutional or even global policy that has really made a difference for inclusion and access?
Go ahead, Cailyn. I'll go after you.
I think the one that I get most excited about is course marking, which is just such a simple concept and so common sense. But I think that it can even have outside like effects people don't even think about. So course marking is letting students know how much they're going to be spending on textbooks and materials before they register for the class. And this can look like anything from marking which classes are using open books or library resources or zero cost or low cost to just like saying, yeah, this class, if you sign up for it, expect to pay about $230. And I think that one, students should be able to financially plan before they sign up for a class. It's like textbook costs are one of the largest out-of-pocket expenses. Students have different places where they prioritize that cost. And for some students, not being able to afford that, by the time they get into the class and get the syllabus, it's already too late. They can't afford the books. They can't sign up for the other class that might have been cheaper. And it's just going to put a huge wrench in their financial planning and their ability to succeed in that class. And I think one of the things I like about this is you've seen examples of this from institutions, so individual schools taking it upon themselves to figure out what works, all the way up to state level. So states saying you got to tell people, you got to mark these classes. And it can just look so different depending on what they want to do. So for example, at UC Berkeley, it links you to the school store so you can see what the rental book is, what a used copy looks like, or the other copy. At Georgia State, you can actually filter the classes based on how much you can spend. And then in other schools, it's just like a little tag, like in Connecticut, that's like, this is a zero cost or a low cost book. And students can go by and look for like the stickers. And so I just think that like, this is a really great way to include, like for students to be able to figure out what they need. It's a policy that can make a really big impact, in part because it just adds a little of that competition back into the textbook marketplace. Because now the students, the consumers, can have a bit of choice, which was one of the things that was missing beforehand. And they can just make informed choices before they just sign up for a class. So I'm a huge fan of course marking, and I can talk about it all day, every day.
I'm so fascinated with that. And one of the things that I would love to do is see more states gather together to kind of put pressure on the technology vendors that provide course markings, so that rather than that being a state by state or institution by institution add-on or customization, that it's something that is just offered and it's just part of the package for students and institutions, rather than each of us having to customize those course markings individually. Anyway, that's my way to kind of crowdsource it or to scale it. But those examples you gave are fantastic. I'm wondering if Cable has policy examples that are more global, and all your perspectives are so great. Thank you for coming at this from different angles.
So I'll share kind of the 4 areas of policy that we work on a lot at Creative Commons and in conjunction with our other NGO colleagues. And you don't have to write this down. I'll share the notes in chat in just a moment. The first bucket is what we call open licensing policies. So this is where the funder could be a government, national, provincial, state, or local. It could be a foundation, a philanthropic entity. It could be an education institution or a system, or it could be a content provider, somebody like OpenStax. But the open licensing policy usually is if you take our money to do something, that part of the requirement of that contract or grant is that you put an open license on the thing that you built. So the example that Nicole just gave a minute ago about the U.S. Department of Education open textbook pilot, the U.S. Department of Education actually has a rule or a policy, if you will, that says if you take discretionary grant funds from them, that you will put the equivalent of a Creative Commons attribution license on what you build. And that's a requirement. They've got some outs for particular kinds of grants, but for the most part, it's required. Department of Labor, same thing. You take a discretionary grant from labor, you have to put a CC BY license on it. USAID does this, multiple programs in the Department of State. So, and part of the communication there is, if you're going to take our money, you're going to share what you build. And it's not optional. It's not a conversation we're going to have. You're going to share what we build. And from a government standpoint, or from a systems standpoint, and let me share a link here. This was a long time ago, but we worked with the Chancellor's office, so at a system level in the California community colleges. And the Chancellor's office said, if you take money from us, we're not talking about block grants. We're not talking about your main budgets. We're not saying you have to open everything that you do. What we're saying is that for those optional discretionary funds, which nobody's required to apply for, but from time to time we put out grants. On those things, you have to put a Creative Commons attribution license on what you build. And from a funder's standpoint, it's a much better return on investment. It's higher impact, because I used to give the grant to one entity, and that one entity would create it, but then they owned it and they didn't necessarily have to share it with anybody else. And when there's this open license requirement, that sharing requirement is built in, if you will. The second bucket of things is kind of the opposite of that. Whereas open licensing policies are very top down, if you take the money, you'll openly license it. The second category, which I'll share here, is what we call open procurement. And open procurement is really bottom up. So it's the school district or the education institution, the university or the college or the system that's saying, we have a budget, and before we go out into the market and buy X, whatever it is that we need, when we buy something, we, the school, we, the university, will hold the copyright to it, and you, the marketer, work for hire for us. And then because we hold the copyright, we'll put an open license on what we build. Another bucket is, getting a little bit more nitty gritty into higher ed, is promotion and tenure. And so when we're looking at promotion and tenure, oftentimes, when you're putting together your portfolio as a faculty member, it's your research, it's your teaching, and your service. And so if P&T committees can signal to their faculty that publishing in open access journals or in other means that provide open access to the research, that's a positive thing and not negative, faculty would be more likely to do it. If they can signal to faculty that opening up and sharing their educational resources, the curricular materials that they're building, is a positive thing and not negative, faculty are more likely to do it. And the last example I'll give is, and Tanya was hinting at this, is what's happening internationally. So there's a relatively new, this got passed in November of 2019, something called the UNESCO recommendation on open educational resources. And I've provided a link there to the actual document if you want to go read it. And the reason this is important, this isn't I guess it's a international policy, but it's really this kind of voluntary framework. What's interesting about it is that all of the UNESCO members, all 193 national governments that are members of UNESCO, signed on unanimously in consensus and said, this is important. These are things that we need to work on. And if you look at the recommendation, it's a very detailed set of actions that national governments can take to support all aspects of open education in their countries. And so to the extent that you might be a university or a system of education or a regional compact like WCET and WICHE and others, but you might look at that recommendation and say, are there aspects of this that we could also reinforce at a regional or at a state or at an institution level? Thanks, Tanya.
I think you just touched on sorry for my dog, but one of Tiffany Harrison is one of our participants, and she asked what is an immediate policy that we could work on in the United States? And I'm just wondering if you have kind of a lightning round, what's your number one top policy that you think would really help right now, especially in navigating the immediate future and the new normal? Can you just each throw out what you think is your top priority?
Recognize open educational resources and open access publications and tenure and promotion policies.
course marking. Let students have a choice on what classes they want to take and how much they want to pay, so that way they can financially plan.
An executive order from a new administration that requires that all publicly funded federal education and research resources are openly licensed by default.
Ooh, that's like a dream bucket list. And I have another question from Wanda Barker, and she was wondering how you would recommend OER advocates to incorporate cultural examples or exercises into OER as they reuse and remix resources. So she's really interested in equity and access and inclusion about OER. And where would you point somebody who's interested in doing that?
So I think that question has a couple of different answers. So one is the technical answer, like how do you get new examples into a textbook? And there are actually a lot of fabulous resources out there about how to revise and adapt open textbooks. So I guess the first step would be reaching out to your library or other experts in your state to help with the technical side of things. In terms of what is most relevant for the students and how to decide what to put in there, I think that's an important conversation to be had within, maybe the department or the individual faculty member to think about who is in my classroom and whose voices maybe aren't being heard and who isn't able to see themselves in the materials that I'm teaching from. I think, some very easy places to start are considering factors like race and ethnicity, but also LGBTQIA inclusiveness and gender inclusiveness. I'll look up the link and share it, but there's actually a collection of public domain images that were just released that include the full gender spectrum. So there's small, I guess, relatively small steps that can be taken, like choosing one image over another that can actually make a big difference for individual students.
Cailyn, what do you think about including diversity and voices in materials?
This is something, when I talk to students that I work with about the possibilities of open, and I talk about this is something that they get incredibly excited about and think is something, one, super cool, but also like, well, I can't believe that this isn't more of a thing. So I would actually be curious what would happen if you asked the students that you work with what they would want to see and what they think has been missing from other materials that they've seen. So I think that their answers might surprise you. I think that it can be incredibly broad. And if you just prime that a little bit, we're like, what does inclusion and diversity mean to you? And you make a big list with students. I think that this could be a place where you can incorporate them. To give a preview of one of the other questions, I think that we need to move beyond student voice and listening to students and start instead making space for student action and for student participation. And I think this is a place where you can bring that in for more voices being included and what that even means.
This was probably one of the most interesting and exciting discussions I've had for a while. Here I am in my kitchen with my cat, and I get to learn all about the new things that you all know about. Thank you so much for sharing this with the WCET people who are fascinated with technology, education, and policy. We're all interested in what the next big thing we can do is to help students. And thank you so much for discussing open policy and the impact it has on access and inclusion. Thank you so much to Nicole Allen, Cable Green, and Cailyn Nagle. I wish it could go on for another hour, but we'll just sign off from here. Thanks, everybody.